event, and it's very useful and very needed for all of us, because editors and authors, there are not two different camps that can combat each other. They have a very clear and common mission, common aims to have a good content, to be published, to be written, and to be visual. So for me, it's a very important topic that we are talking in 1 minute about English language, because this is my program based in Ukraine, and it's not in native language. We publish in English for 10 years, and I know about a lot of problems that face authors and also face editorial board when they receive a good article, but it's poor English. And now I give the floor to Mark, and your topic, how to deal with English language problems, tips for good scientific writing.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and I hope everybody had a good lunch. And this afternoon, I'm going to start with talking on some tips for good language writing. Now, as we only have 50 minutes for this, I'm afraid I can't solve every language problem. So I hope to give you just a few tips and some ideas to do with language that will help you to write clearer articles. I should also say that I know English is a second language for you, but many of the problems that you will encounter when you're writing language are the same as for any early career researcher in Britain. And as an editor, I can tell you that British native English speakers can write truly, truly dreadful articles. So this is a presentation that I would like to give to many of my authors as well, to teach them how to write better articles. So PLOS One, they have a very useful bullet point list on their website about what makes a good article. And at the top, they say for them it's primary research. That's what they're looking for. And this goes back to what I was talking about before lunch, about checking the author guidelines and making sure you're selecting the right journal. They also want something that is new, that has not been published elsewhere. I've put an asterisk against this. For those of you that are going to be here tomorrow, I'm going to briefly mention preprints, which is where you post your the version of article that you intend to submit to a journal onto a public repository. This is a fairly new development. Does anyone here work in physics or maths? Don't think there's anyone. But anyone that works in physics and maths, the idea of putting your article online before you submit it to a journal has been commonplace for 20 years, but in other areas it's fairly new. They then say that they want the experiments, the statistics, etc. to be performed to a high standard. And of course this is obvious. A good quality article has high standard methodology. The conclusions supported by the data. It's very easy, because you're so excited by the research you've done, by the findings you've discovered, it's very easy in an article to add things into the conclusions that you haven't presented earlier in the results. Because when you're writing an article, you're having to prioritize the content you want to put into that article from the wealth of information that you've discovered in your research. And it means that when you get to the conclusions and the discussion, it's very... I'm going to move over this side of the stage. So, I've forgotten where I was now. So, it's very easy for extra bits of information to creep into the article. So you need to be aware of this and to make sure that your conclusions only talk about the things that you've discussed in the article, that you don't start adding in new things and new thoughts at that point. That the article is presented in an intelligible fashion. This is language and structure, which is what I'm talking about here. And of course, ethics are important. We're talking about that later. And reporting guidelines and community standards. By community standards, they mean like international standards of how you publish an article, so that you do not, for example, submit the same version of the article to 20 journals at the same time in the hope that one of those journals will accept it. So standards are important. So the first slide I've put here is about the content. The content of the article has to be good, and I said that earlier. A clear objective and a rationale. Why did you do this research? Robust methodology and standards. And a good article has good publishing standards as well as research integrity standards. So plagiarism, copyright, confidentiality, and authorship, items that we're discussing later this afternoon. But beyond the content, what about the style? What about the language that you express your research with? The first thing to point out is that there are cultural differences between language. So the Anglo-American style is a linear form of language. We favour short sentences, very succinct, almost a bullet point list when it comes to writing. We do not look for more intricate analysis. So the French language, for example, the style of writing in French is a much more, it's hard even for me to describe it. It's a much more convoluted structure of the language. So you introduce a topic and talk around the topic and then come to, you have digressions and then come to the conclusions. But the style that most journals follow Western journals, is the Anglo-American style, short linear structures. So if somebody says your sentences are not explicit, they're saying that it's not clear. But in some cultures, that to say something is not explicit is seen as slightly patronising. But the Anglo-American way says actually things need to be explicit. To a certain extent, and please do not quote me on this, particularly not to any American or UK editor, apart from me and Anna, you need to write an article as though you're writing it for a child. You need to make sure everything is clarified, everything is described. You need to assume the person you're writing it for does not have your knowledge. And when you're so firmly embedded in your own area of research, it's easy to forget that the people reading your articles are not the specialists. You are the specialist, which is why you've done the research and why you have published that article. But you're writing it for people that are not specialists, and therefore you need to explain. Oh, it's just there, is it? That looked bigger. I thought it looked more exciting to use. Felt more like a pop star. Okay. So linear development or digressive text. In the humanities, you sometimes go for digressive text, which is where you talk around a subject rather than talking about a subject. But again, it's a style that's not commonly favoured. We prefer things to be more obvious and more blunt. Follow. That's praise indeed, because you want people to be able to follow your text easily and without having to. And the last one, to tell or to sell. To sell in this context is effectively selling your research to the editor, to the reviewers, to tell them how exciting it is. And to a certain extent, when you're writing your research, it's telling a story and it's trying to get your reader to be as excited about your research and your findings as you are. So you're not just telling them, we did this, this, this. You want to say, we did this, 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 because we had this question and we found these answers. And therefore, we can move on our discipline, our subject. We have actually contributed to it.
So to a certain extent, you think of describing things more positively in the way that you're presenting your text. Now, what style do we favour? Short sentences. A tip that's but it also works for writing an article, is not to write a paragraph, but to write every sentence as a bullet point. So literally bullet point by bullet point by bullet point. Because then you can actually see how each sentence flows. You can quickly see if you have a sentence that is too long, and it allows you to check that the logic of your argument follows, step to step to step. So if you're writing an article, that's quite a useful tip, is to write as a bullet point list and then join it up into a paragraph at the end. So short sentences are much clearer, much easier to understand. So one of the tips as well when you go through your article to revise it before submitting it. If you remember this morning I said revise it by 25%. One tip is to look at the article and say, how much shorter can I make this article? Can I lose a number of words? Can I reduce the size of it? Now when I write, I put too many words in, and I know that's my style. So when I've finished writing, I set myself a challenge of reducing the article by 25%. Sometimes it works, but the point is to go through an article and make everything shorter, make everything more succinct. And it might not read like a great literary novel, but it will be easy for the readers, and particularly easy for the reviewers and the editors, and those are the people you really need to sell your article to. The active voice, and this is something that has changed in the last 20 years. Again, the Anglo-American style favours very direct speech. We did this, not this was done. So it's very particular. So there are 3 examples. So the first one is in the passive voice, that the responses to fiscal policy changes were observed to be different. Now you can understand it, but it's very flat, it's not dynamic, and it's also, it sometimes takes 2 or 3 readings to understand what the author is saying. The next one is much better. We observed that responses to fiscal policy changes were different. And that's better, and that's active, and that's bringing the authors in, and it's easier to write. So when you're sitting to write your article, it's easier to say, well, we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, rather than trying to flip it about this was done, and then this was done. So writing in the active voice can actually be easier to write than the passive. And sometimes you think, well, let's just reduce it down even more. Fiscal policy changes showed different responses. Actually, why do we need to say that we observed that? Why don't we just say they were different, if it's explained further elsewhere in the article? So the active voice is a key one. Also, positive statements. Now, this is where sometimes you're writing something and it's difficult to express. And the problem is, once we start typing, it's quite difficult to stop typing, and so you end up adding more and more words to a sentence to try and make sense. And if you're doing that, delete the whole sentence and just think, how would I say this? And then that's what you type. So there, negative statements are very difficult to read, and you can get in a complete tangle. So, yes. That's a case of what on earth was the author talking about when she wrote this? Simple words as well. It is not more impressive to use inflated words. Use simple terminology. Editors actually are not looking for people to use, proper words like elevated when they could use raised. Now there are times when elevated is the right term, But if I was saying that, I don't know, expectations were elevated, that's sort of wrong. It would say expectations were raised. So be careful when you're writing. You don't have to impress the editor by using inflated words. Also, so prior or before, there's a few examples. Also beware of inflation and redundancy. So inflation is where you're saying, this is really brilliant. You don't need to say really brilliant. This is brilliant, but not really brilliant. Absolute perfection, most important. So again, this is where you can get rid of words, and it's coming back, it's trying to simplify what you're saying. And particularly if English is not your first language, try to say things in as few words as possible, because the longer the sentence is, the more complicated the syntax of that sentence becomes, and the harder it is to control it. And so if English isn't your first language, if you keep sentences short, it will be easier to express yourself accurately than if you're trying to write in very long sentences. So inflation, redundancy, and style. So just in summary, short sentences, active voice, positive statements, simple words, and beware inflation and redundancy. Teaching about English language for writing articles could be a several-day course, so this is a really short snapshot. Now, I know that some of you will use English language companies who can rewrite your articles for you. Some of them are very good, some of them are not very good. To a certain extent, you get what you pay for, which is a problem. So if you pay an awful lot of money for individual attention, you'll get a very good article. If you don't pay very much money, the chances are they will not do very much to your article. There are good companies, and if you're going to pay anybody to edit your language, make sure it's somebody that comes with a recommendation from someone you work with. Also, do check what they've written. Make sure when you get the article back, you must read it and check that you agree with what they've said. If there are any large sections that you think they've written incorrectly, because you've paid these people, my advice is to go back to them to say, you have misunderstood this section, can you do it again, rather than trying to rewrite it yourself. Because as an editor, I can quite often recognise when an article has been edited by a commercial company, and the author has gone back in and corrected some bits. And often the way that they've corrected them has made that section less clear, which is why they needed the services of an English translator at the beginning. Now, if you think that your article needs English language, English language editing, and this is before you've submitted it to a journal, my advice would be, if the journal accepts it, I would spend a lot of time on the abstract and the title, and I would send that to the journal before you pay for the English language editing. And the reason for that, if the journal will accept it, not all will, is to test whether that journal is interested in that research, in that article. Because if they're not interested, you're going to waste your money spending money on an English language service, which will then be rejected or major revisions. So I would actually advise communicating with the journal editor to send them the abstract, maybe also offer to send them the methodology section if you're in the life sciences or the pure and applied. If you're in the arts, the social sciences and humanities, maybe a longer description of what you did, but no more than perhaps one page, to say would they be interested, and to say to them, because if you are, then I will get my article English edited for language before I submit it to you. And that will also make the editor appreciative that you're not going to waste their time, either with an article which is not of interest to them, or an article that's badly written because you want to reserve the right to edit it at a later stage. So this comes back to communication with an editor. Now, not all journals will accept these are called sort of pre-proposals or pre-submissions. But if they do, then I'd encourage you to do this as a first step. So now you've got the perfectly written, so the language isn't a problem. The next thing that you really must think about is the structure of an article. And the structure can also help you with the expression and the language. So Anna has already mentioned IMRAD, which is the introduction, the method, results, and discussion. But I would also argue that because my area is social science, IMRAD also works in the social sciences as well, not so much in humanities, so the arts and literature, but it does work for social science articles as well, although in a slightly different frame. So the introduction is exactly the same. What is known and what was the point of the research that you did? The method, what did we do? Whereas if you were dealing with a life science article, for example, or a medical article, that section would be, I think, 6 paragraphs, Anna suggested. In a social sciences article, that might be maybe 2 sentences. So it might be quite small because it might be as simple as we did a literature review of this subject. And that's fine, but you still need, what did you actually do as part of your research? So what is known about the subject and why did we raise this question? And then what did we do? And then you get to the results, what did we discover? And the discussion. And also in social sciences, sometimes the results and discussion are merged. And you can have a section which is results and discussion, where you say, we discovered that these authors proposed this system, but when we compared it to these authors, they proposed a different system, and amalgamating the two, we've come up with this proposal. So you can combine those 2 sections in some articles. So the introduction. A common thing I find is that introductions tend to be somewhere where the author is boasting. And they can sometimes turn into look what I've read. I've read all these articles, and then I read these articles, and these articles, and these articles. Whereas that's very boring for a reader. What a reader wants to know is, briefly, what's the key knowledge about this area? What are the key publications about this area? I don't want to know everyone that's written about this. I want to know what's the important knowledge and publications. So what's known? Don't bore the readers, the editors, and the reviewers with writing an introduction that is too long and too wordy, and don't boast. And in the last paragraph, at the end of this, so having evaluated what is known about the subject, what is your question? And interestingly, there was a survey of authors done by the editing company Edans recently, and their findings were that between 60 and 70% of people that answered the survey said that they found formulating the research question very difficult. And I've got to admit, I was very, very surprised by that, because in my mind, if you are doing any research, even if it's a review of what has been written about a subject, you're doing it to answer a question. And that is the question in your article. And it may be a question about, we wanted to know why we had elevated blood pressure in rats. Or it might be, we wanted to find out what was the economic situation in Croatia in the 1980s. That is still a research question. So that's really important, is to clarify that, because the editors and the reviewers want to know why you did this research and what is the point of this article. If there is no point to an article, they're not going to want to publish it. The results and the discussion. Now, of course, if you're writing one joint section, this is different. But if you're writing 2 sections, with the results are the basic descriptive data. We had 112 people reply to our survey. Of these, 30% were from Turkey. We discovered that 66% of them said they had problems articulating a research question. That's the results. Don't add references in a results section, because once you start adding references, it means you're referring to what someone else has discovered, and that means you've started to discuss it. If you need to add a reference, it means that sentence should be in the discussion, not in the results. Now, there are some exceptions, but as a general rule, you wouldn't have references in a results section. Because the discussion is where you say, having this information discovered, this is what we think about this. This is what those findings tell us. In the discussion, don't repeat the introduction. A lot of people do this. They start the discussion by effectively saying, we knew this about this subject. And actually that's already in the introduction. You don't need that again in the discussion. The discussion is the discussion of your findings and then comparing them to what's known. Not telling me what's known and then comparing that to your findings. So start with your findings, your conclusions, your observations, and then tie them into what's known. As Anna said, it's important to put in the strengths and weaknesses of your study, to be transparent, to say, we did this study, but actually we know that we should have asked different questions. We are aware that we only had respondents from Turkey and we didn't get anyone from Italy replying. To say that you appreciate the limitations, because that also tells the reviewers and the editors that you're being honest with yourself about the quality and the validity of your research. The meaning of the study and the unanswered questions. This is you coming to a conclusion to say, this tells us that, and I put there not too much. So don't take your results and out of them extricate something which isn't there. So it's that thing about discovering that, that I can't think of any good examples at the moment, but be careful about coming out with a conclusion that isn't there in your article. Be moderate in what you claim. Be positive about what you claim, what you've discovered, but be moderate about it. Now press the wrong button. And the conclusion. Not all articles require a conclusion. But they can be useful. Also be very short. Don't worry about a conclusion which is perhaps 2 sentences. Again, they're not always necessary. Don't repeat things. People often have a tendency in the conclusion to repeat the introduction and the discussion all over again. You don't need to do that. Only say something once in the article. Don't be afraid in the article of saying, we discovered this as already described above. So you can refer to places earlier in the article where you describe things. So what you're saying in the conclusion is what this adds, why the research was worthwhile, and the next steps. So other next steps are, we've discovered this, and in which case we need further research to tell us something else. Or is it, we've discovered this, perfect, we can now forget about this problem and move on to another subject completely. Or is it we discovered this, which might tell us this, but not necessarily. So moderate what you're saying there. But the conclusion is not always necessary, but can be quite a useful way of wrapping things up in one sentence at the end. The key thing to remember, so the key thing to remember is that writing is for the benefit of the readers, and the readers do not know as much as you know. So I just want to finish with just a few things. The two most important parts of your article, if you're thinking about being published, so the most important parts of your article for the editor and the reviewers are the title and the abstract. So the title, don't make it too long. It needs to be comprehensive, but not too long. Otherwise, it's difficult to read. Avoid abbreviations and jargon, and don't choose clever titles. And unfortunately, this is the internet, this is the Google effect on journals. You need to make sure that your article title has the keywords that the person that you want to read your article is going to use. So if I'm looking for an article on chickens, and you're writing an article, make sure you put the word chickens into it. And then when I do a Google search, I will find your article. So you need to think, what are the key words that somebody is going to search for if they're coming to your article, and get them in the title. So if you did an analysis of I'm gathering gadgets. So if you did a research article, perhaps about child mortality in Croatia, you need to think, if somebody wants to find this information, what words are they going to put into Google? And are they going to put child and mortality in Croatia in which case I have to have those 3 words in my title. So put them in. So really important to think about this. Also, avoid redundant words like we did a preliminary, this is a preliminary study of something. Just saying it's a study is fine. Fingers crossed. Nope. That one's not working. No problem. Okay, I think this is working now. Now, the importance of the abstract is that, as this article from the BMJ says, a lot of editors, they will give your article a quick check before they decide whether it's a desk reject or whether they will send it out to review. And if they've only got 2 minutes, they will read the abstract, and that's what they will make their decision on. So the abstract is vitally important. And the BMJ have actually published this. Please get the abstract right, because we may use it alone to assess your paper. So the abstract is the most important part of your paper when you're looking at getting published. Right, another important thing. The abstract is not an introduction. The abstract is a summary of your entire paper, not the introduction as this is what is known about this subject and why we did this research. If I'm looking at the abstract, I want to know, very briefly, why should I read this paper? What is in this paper that's useful to me? So you need to think of it as the advertising for your article, the shop window. It needs to have enough information to be informative, but it also has to have enough information to make someone want to read your article. So you need to be succinct, and you also need to be selective in what you put in the abstract, because you'll have more results and more findings and more observations than you can fit in an abstract. So you need to prioritise the most important and the most interesting to potential readers and reviewers. Again, think of it like a bullet list. The first bullet, not much is known about this subject. So tell me a little bit about that, 1 sentence. The subject of child mortality is very under-researched in Croatia. So we wanted to answer this question. Therefore, we wanted to find out what the incidence of mortality was. Then we did this thing. So therefore, to investigate mortality, we ran a survey of public hospitals between 2016 and 2018. Then the results. We found out that mortality over the last 20 years was reported to have reduced from 3% to 2%. And that's your highlight research finding, because you'll have other research findings, but you want to put the highlights in the abstract. And then we concluded this. From our results, we concluded the maternal services have improved in the country, but more research on this is required. And that's the abstract. So thinking of the abstract like a bullet list, not much is known. This was our question, we did this, we found this, and we concluded this. And if you think of it like a bullet point list and you prioritise the most interesting things out of your article, to put them in this. You will make it more attractive to the editor, so you'll get past the desk reject and it will get sent out to reviewers. You'll make it more interesting for the reviewers, so they're more likely to be positive when they read your article. And then when you're published, you're more likely to get readers because they're going to come in because they found the abstract interesting. Remember that in almost every journal, even if the journal and the article is behind a paywall, the abstract is free to view. And so you want to tempt in everybody with the title and the abstract. Really, really important. I would also suggest don't write the abstract until you've finished the article, until you've had your colleagues check the article, until you've edited it and you think it's perfect, then write the abstract. Because that whole process will allow you to sit back and then consider what is the important points that I should be making in the abstract. And this does work in other areas as well. I struggle with my journal I end up rewriting abstracts a lot. My authors tend to use the abstract as an introduction. And it's because they go, well, this structure doesn't work. It works in proper research, like medical research or life science research, but it doesn't work in social sciences, and it does. The same structure works. It can be slightly different, so not much is known about publishing in Turkey. We wanted to find out what the experiences of editors were working in Turkey. So we ran a survey in August of editors within the country. The results we found were that editors were mostly satisfied with their institutional support but had problems finding reviewers, and we concluded that further support is required. So it works in social science. So just to summarise this section then, for language, be succinct, better for clarity, don't make inflated claims, so make sure your article focuses on what you want to write about. Don't bring in other ideas. You can always put them into another article. The structure is very important, with particular attention on the abstract and the title as the two key points to get you through the review process and then to ensure that your article is read. Thank you very much.
Presentation. My name is Mustafa Inan from Balkan Medical Journal. I have a question about the location of limitations. If I cannot misunderstand, Anna said it should be located on just beginning of the discussion section, but I think you think different. What's your opinion about this topic, this issue?
So was this where you put the research question about this is what we know?
That's all the limitations. The limitations of the study.
Limitations of the study, sorry. It depends. I think I would put the limitations either in the discussion or actually as a separate section at the end. So for some journals, they have, in the author guidelines, they would say this structure and then acknowledgements for the people that have helped you perhaps with the article, and then limitations of study as a section. And that's where you would put the limitations. But other journals, they don't have a specific place to put it. So if they don't have a specific place on their author guidelines, then I would put it probably in the discussion. But I think it depends on the journal. You need to see what the journal's style is. And also, as an author, where you think it fits. So you might consider that when you finish the article, oh, we haven't mentioned limitations, and in which case that implies it doesn't fit naturally into any one place in the article. So I would make a heading at the end, before the references, limitations, and write the statement there. And in other times, when you're actually writing the discussion, you'll be going, you'll be writing it and you'll think, to get anybody from Italy to reply, and then you would mention it actually there. We realised that one of the limitations was there. So sometimes it's an official statement, and sometimes it can be incremental throughout the discussion.
Sorry. Sorry, may I take your attention? You take your attention. You can take your receipts and registration date.
When you submit a journal, so that, for example, at least in medicine, the process of submitting a journal can take up to 2 or 3 hours. It's not something that you have your paper, you put it in an envelope and send it to a journal, or you just click on an email attachment and send it with your message. But this process is now much more complex. And this has been involvement, especially with the digital age and digital publishing and increased transparency of research. So many things are required from you. We do not have time to go into all the details, but I'm going to talk about what is called a publication integrity or research integrity in general. This is a buzzword that is used by many granting agencies in the European Union, and Turkey is a part of the Horizon 2020, which is a research framework for Europe, and there are grants and grantees from Turkey, and you have such grants here in Turkey. And they also have all kinds of requirements that you're obliged to follow in order that it is assured that your research is trustworthy and that people can believe it. Okay? So this is about research integrity. So we are going to first have some definitions. What is research integrity? You will hear this word. You will hear the word responsible conduct of research. You will hear the word responsible research and innovation, which is a European term, whereas responsible conduct of research is a term that is used in the United States and their fund, especially the NIH as a big funder in medicine, but equally the National Science Foundation, which funds research in other areas of science in the United States. So this is a definition that is accepted today in the field of research integrity. This has become a research field. Before it was something that maybe philosophers think about, but nowadays, for example, the European Union has a whole set of grants under the group of grants in the Horizon that calls science with and for society, they look into the relationship between science and society and how science should be responsible to society and how society should take more place in forming and directing research activities and priorities. And you have in the graph that look into this normative aspect, what are the definitions? Can we agree what is research ethics and what is research integrity? So this is a definition that is kind of generally accepted in the area of the discipline of research integrity research, which defines these extremes of behavior in science, from ideal behavior, which is called the responsible conduct of research, to the worst behavior, which is actually criminal behavior, and you can end up in jail with this, which is usually in most of the countries, but there are also differences that we're going to talk about, which is called FP, or 3 major frauds. So this is really a crime, that you either invent data that didn't exist at all, that you fabricate data, that you falsify data, and that means that you change your data so that it fits your purpose. So some things are not clear, so I will change this number, I will delete that number, I will add this little number so that I get a p-value less than 0.05 and my results are significant, and then I'm going to send it to a journal. And in between, you see here, this is what's called QRP. So these are all the kind of bad practices in research that we see that may not have such drastic consequences like publishing lies or publishing other works, which is the P here in FFP, which stands for plagiarizing or stealing someone else's work. But these are all types of sloppy science, that you don't do your studies well, that you don't measure, you don't calculate your sample size properly, you do not adequately present your data, you use a wrong statistical analysis, you inflate the conclusions of your study, and so on and so on. These are all questionable research practices, but the current term, so the kind of main body for research integrity in the United States, their Academy of Sciences, said the term that we're going to use now is detrimental research practices. I don't know, in Europe I'm not quite satisfied with that, because some of these practices are not detrimental. They don't really change the results of the study, but they kind of diminish the trust of the public in scientific research, like authorship. If there are disputes about authorship on a paper, it will not affect the validity of the results that are presented in the study, but it will really cause problems, and they may harm people, the authors, either because they didn't get recognition for them as the authors, or they got credit for something they didn't do, which is unfair. So this is a framework, or the normative framework where we work in. And this is just an example how we do sloppy science. So these are 2 figures from the journal Cell. If there are biologists here or people from life sciences, they will have heard about Cell, which is a journal that has a very high impact factor where you publish the discovery of new genes, and it's really prestigious. So if you have a journal published in a Cell, it's almost like getting the Nobel Prize. So, can anyone see something that is a bit odd or incorrect? Just read the last sentences in these legends to the 2 figures published in Cell. Okay, I will circle the important things here. So these guys say, okay, we measured something, and this is the picture with the values of measurement, and we express them as averages plus minus means. Any mathematicians here? Average and mean is the same thing. I teach students, whenever you're measuring something in a sample, you have to use 2 numbers. One number is the number that is presenting everything that you measure. One number number that describes best all of the numbers that you got. That's the measure of central tendency. It's either average or mean for normally distributed populations, or it is a median for distributions that don't follow distributions of your data. And you also have to show the variation, the precision of what you measure, and for that you use the measure of variability, which is the standard deviation interquarter range. But to write that you measure something as averages plus minus means instead of averages plus minus standard deviation is something that I would flunk my first year student on a statistics course because they don't know this. And this was published in the journal Cell. You can find these things in Nature and Science. And this slide is, as I said, was a courtesy of David Wall. He's a cancer researcher whose hobby is to catch statistical errors in high-impact journals. So he reads Nature and Science and points to them, no guys, this is wrong, this is not how you present data properly, this is statistically completely wrong. And they say, oh, we apologize, we'll improve statistical review of our papers better than they do, because this repeats and repeats. And this is an example of sloppy science, of these questionable research practices. And then, you wonder as an observer from outside, if nobody saw this, this is so common sense that you don't try mean plus minus mean or average plus minus average, because this is what it means. But that nobody noticed this. Okay, you can say authors don't know. They are lab researchers, they don't know statistics. But reviewers didn't see. The editor who made the decision and probably read the paper didn't see it. The technical editors, because in these big journals we have a whole army of editors working on your paper. That's really a good thing of publishing in high-impact famous journals, because they really take good care of you. Currently they say at the Lancet, they have Lancet and several sister journals, 150 editors work on a journal. And for us, in small journals, it's probably one person that is doing everything plus perhaps somebody who helps or a secretary. So you wonder, if nobody can see this, what kind of other things we find here? There are many problems with scientific editing and the trust in science if these things happen. So, what we're going to talk about, when we talk about the responsible conduct of research, we have to differentiate between research ethics and research integrity. So, this is a definition of research integrity. It's in a way kind of professional performance doing research. So that we as researchers have the responsibility as our professional organizations, institutions, to ensure that what we do is reliable, can be trusted, and that we have done it with full integrity. So research ethics is usually defined as actually what you can do with the object of your research. If you work in animals, these are the rules and ethics codes, what can be done, what kind of experiments can be done, what you do to alleviate the suffering of animals in your research, and so on and so on. So these are all humans. You have to follow the Helsinki Declaration, you have to go through the ethics committee, you have to informed consent, you have to protect the vulnerable populations, you have to create stigmatization of the participants in your research, and so on and so on. There are ethical principles, what we can do with the objects of our research. On the other hand, research integrity is how well we do our job. So me, as a professional, doing research in the right way, following the standards of practice in my field. If I have digital images, I will not manipulate them to show on them something that is not true, that I hide information and information. I will not copy from other people their ideas or lots of text from ideas, which we're going to talk about plagiarism, which is probably a very specific case and not so clear case of good or bad research practices. So, do you have a code of conduct for research at the university? Do you have to sign anything when you begin? Do you know what are the rules for doing research at your university? Who owns, for example, the also with you? What are the rules for authorship? So all these things that affect what we as researchers do fall under the research integrity topics. And today there are different activities and ways of how to increase this research integrity. What is most relevant for us, perhaps, and I don't know if your university is part of the All-European Academies, it's called ALIA. ALIA has produced a European Code of Conduct for Responsible Research, which has become a part of the Horizon framework, so research funding framework in Europe, and everybody who does research obliges to follow these rules in performing research. When you sign a grant contract with the European Union, that you get money for a wide package or a project from the European Union, from the Horizon framework, you also have to sign that you're going to follow this code of conduct, and you have an obligation, like deliverables, as they say in the grant talk, that you have to deliver also ethical documents and approvals for the research that you do. So this is something that has become a reality. And of course, it all came by the end of the 60s, when there were major scandals, first in the USA and then later on, that showed that people cheated, that a lot of money was spent on research that cannot be trusted, and that we need to increase the awareness of the importance of good research. So, responsible conduct of research has two aspects. One is research ethics, of how we perform our research on the subject of research. It's viewed from the moral perspective. And then we have research integrity, which is the view from the professional standards. So what are the standards how we perform our work? In many fields, you have, professional codes for engineers or all kinds of disciplines, and now we have them also for research. So what is it involved? Responsible conduct of research addresses how you plan research, so that you are responsible and that you respect all different aspects of your research so that it really can serve the community. It involves ethical issues, so how you're going to protect human subjects, animals, what kind of conflicts of interest you may have. If you receive money from a pharma industry for your research, this can be a potential conflict of interest. It doesn't mean that your research will not be valid, but it's something that has to be declared so that people who read or study your research can make their own judgment whether you were in conflict or whether you change your research so that you will satisfy your funders. That is, for example, the reason whenever you write a declaration in your manuscript about funding, many journals will tell you it's not enough to say this research was funded by the Trakia University or whatever granting service that you get, but you also have to add a statement. The funder had no role in planning, executing, or writing up research that's presented in this manuscript. So you have to assure that you, as a researcher, was independent in publishing and executing research, and that the money that you brought in did not influence this process. Also, it's about conducting research. What are the good practices in data collection, executing research, how you do your laboratory books, how you put your data in a safe space. I don't know if Turkey also implemented the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is about privacy and protection of individuals, which has had a lot of influence on how we can and what we can do with data that we collect from individuals. It was meant to protect people from the internet and abuse on the internet, but it's also had influence on how we do research. If you're doing a survey and you're an online survey, and if you're collecting IP addresses of your respondents, you're collecting their personal data, which is regulated, which is actually forbidden without special permission by the GDPR. So you have to know that you have to calibrate your online survey system that it doesn't collect IP addresses of the respondents, because then only then you can say to the respondents, we're going to collect the data fully, anonymously, and your identity will not be revealed. So your email is the personal data. So this is something that you have to keep in mind, especially if you want to engage in more international research. This will affect your work too. Also, this is about mentor and trainee responsibilities. Many professions, and I know it was for a long time, for example, the American Psychological Association, which is the largest body actually in social sciences that determines how you cite your references, like a Harvard style and so on. It also at some point said, if you're publishing from a PhD thesis, the student has to be the sole author of the publication stemming from PhD thesis. Nowadays, when we have more collaborative research, they change this role in their ethics code of the profession to say, if you publish papers from students' PhD thesis, PhD student has to be the first author of these papers, because this is what should be in a relationship between a PhD student and his or her mentor. Also, what about collaborative research? We have seen this morning that authorship may be an important issue in multidisciplinary research, because a chemist will have one idea of authorship, I, coming from medical science, will have one, and the physicist would expect to have 5,000 people on a paper. So these things are important, and you have to at least know a bit about them in order to prevent, not to deal with problems when they arise, but to prevent them, hopefully, that they appear at all. And also, it's also about reporting and reviewing research, and this is what we call a publication integrity. So publication ethics. What can be done and what cannot be done when publishing research manuscript. It's about authorship, how to publish, it's about peer review, because peer review can also be abused to either promote some research or to suppress some research. And actually, publication integrity is very important, and it's kind of prominent among all of these, because most of the scandals that were discovered in journals. So people read the paper and they see that something is wrong with it. Either, like in the case of Johnson, whose papers in Lancet had to be returned, he invented 200 patients for his study, and everything was a lie. It was discovered by a colleague who was from the same hospitals, who was catching up on our New Year's holidays of literature, and said, well, how come he can have 200 patients when our hospital doesn't have that many patients? And it said that the study was done in this hospital. So everything started, and there was a big inquiry, and the guy was then fired from his place in the hospital and was forbidden to work as a practitioner. He was a dentist for 3 years, and then he has to work as a practicing dentist, but only under supervision because of the research disorder that he did, which was the publication of the data. And because these problems are first seen in journals, then everybody kind of points to us, to editors, and say, oh, how didn't you as editors or reviewers, how didn't you notice this? But sometimes it's very difficult, because what we publish is the best documentation of someone's research. Okay, you will not find a more detailed public account of somebody's research, but in a published paper. You may find it, I don't know, in a report that you submit to your funding agency, a report that you submit to your PhD thesis that may not be available publicly on your university site, or a report submitted to a pharmaceutical industry, but for the public, for everybody to see, it is in the journals. So usually people feel the messages and say, oh, it's editors and viewers, they are guilty because they cannot detect this content. But how can I, as an editor, check that somebody invented it? This is what is known or should be known at the place where the research is produced. They know whether somebody has 20 patients or 200 patients, whether what they measure is reliable or not. So the burden of integrity is not with the journalists, but is with the scientific community and academic community. community at the place where research is done. But unfortunately, we as editors have to take very often this burden, and that's why we have all kinds of standards and procedures in order to at least ensure that, we hope that what we publish is with integrity. For example, this is another slide from David's wall. And you see that this is what people from the left side, these are plots, maybe a northern plot or something, and you see these nice lines, and you see nice differences between the groups, and everything looks fine. But if we use Photoshop to see what has been done with these images, so Photoshop is very good because you can beautify yourself, I don't know, like Kim Kardashian or whatever, but it can also be used to make your slides look nice and beautiful, and you show beautiful differences and clean up everything. But actually, what is the rule in research is that you cannot do anything to a digital image that obstructs or suppresses all the information that is on one image. You can do a lot with Photoshop, but we as editors also know how to use the Photoshop. And we have tools for that. For example, the Office of Research Integrity in the United States, which is the major body that follows research misconduct in research that they fund. They have what is called forensic droplets. So I can download a macro in Photoshop, and then I can use this macro to see what kind of manipulations were done with this figure, with this image. Okay, and there I can put the standards on what can be done. So when you see here, look at what has been done. So you see this.
Where is the laser pointer? Oh, no? Well, if you see there, you clearly see how some of these lines were cut and pasted, how some were also replaced, so there was a lot of image manipulation. Okay. Look here. Look here. Look here. So all of these images were not image of a single gel, but they were pasted from different gels, pretending that they come from the same experiment, showing the same groups and the same time. So this is a big lie, because you cannot say that you did a proper experiment in this way. Or here. Okay. So you have these cells, and you see these are fluorescent images of cells. You think, okay, this is all very nice. But when you look at what has been done, you see that some of these cells have a different background than the others, which means that they were copied from some other image and pasted here. Okay, so this is adjusted for the background changes, and you clearly see that this image was manipulated. Okay? And you may wonder how often is this conduct? How often does it happen? And there have been a systematic review. It's now quite old, almost 10 years old, from 2009. They looked at all studies. They looked at how much serious misconduct, like fabrication and falsification, not including plagiarism. That's why the numbers are low. So the estimate, when they do a meta-analysis of all the studies about what people report for themselves and for the others to do, the prevalence of falsification and publication is about 2%. 2% of the people admitted that they really badly cheated. Of course, they say that's 40% for the others. So the true prevalence of research misconduct is about 14%, which is a lot for science that we learn to trust and to believe. We also, because authorship is very important for small scientific communities. Every paper counts for advancement in professorship and later on. And authorship problems are very common in the scientific community. So we did a systematic review of research on authorship, and we also did a meta-analysis of reported problems
with authorship. And we showed that the prevalence of problems with authorship is 10 times larger than that of misconduct. And also that you can see a difference between developed countries, that's the forest plot which synthesizes results from all the studies there in the upper right corner, which is about 23% in developed countries or international journals. But when you look in smaller scientific community, France included, the reported prevalence of problems with authorship is about 55%. So half of the people will sometime during their research career experience problems and misuse of authorship. So this is a serious problem. As I say, it doesn't affect the validity of science, but it does affect trust and what science should be. So as you see, Turkey here is a white spot, and my country, Croatia, is a white spot because it wasn't a part of the EU at that time. So when you look at what you have to know, you don't need only to know what journals want and what are international standards, but you have to look at the legal regulation in your country. And also not only the legal regulation of what you can do, like what are the ethics bodies, who is going to approve a clinical trial of drugs. It varies from country to country, and you have to know the specific requirements for the country. For example, in Croatia, regardless of who pays for a drug trial, it has to be approved at a national level by a national ethics committee. Regardless of whether it's paid by pharma or it's investigator driven, you just want to test two different medications at your department. For both, it's not enough to have only the approval of the hospital, but you have to go to the national ethics committee. If you don't do that, you are in breach not only of ethics, but also of the legal regulations that actually you will end up in court. And this is the situation in Europe where you have different ways of how people deal with research integrity. When somebody reports that something has stolen or falsified or fabricated. In some countries, like you see here in Norway and Denmark, and now Poland too, this is at the level of the national level. When you are found guilty at the national level, this is legal, and you can go to jail, for example. And some other countries, they are in blue, they have bodies for research integrity, but they are only advisory bodies. They cannot make legal decisions on somebody's cheating or something. And in countries that are in orange here, these are countries where there is no information whether any such type of body exists. Okay? And if you want to look at the situation in Europe, you can go to ENRIO, which stands for European Network of Research Integrity Offices, where you can find all kinds of different experiences for different countries. I think it would be good that Turkey joins. I don't know what is the regulation in your country, both legal and how you deal with research integrity, but this is something that you may think about. I know journals, they are in the basic science journals, that require from their authors in the submission letter that they name a person at their institution who is an ombudsman or research integrity officer they can write to in case somebody makes allegations about your published paper. If somebody says, oh, they stole this from us, or they say, oh, these data are fabricated, they will not even accept your article for submission so that you can send it to a journal unless you provide the name of the person that they can contact your institution to deal with the possible allegations in future. Well, usually 98% of the time it doesn't happen, but only 2 times when there's a really serious breach. So institutions are now expected to have professionals that will deal, not only people listening, but they would help people understand these requirements and help people really publish research and do research that has integrity. So you can go there and, for example, there's a very recently published Netherlands Code of Conduct for Research Integrity at the national level. What are the rules and standards for behavior in research? And also when you look at whether they have local or national commissions, you have, again, a variety of different experiences. And as I said, in Norway, Denmark, and Poland, you have national bodies that have all the legal rights to, I don't know, take away your PhD thesis or retract the paper. And it's not dealt locally at the level of the institution. So, as I said, if you are part of a European research framework and you are part of a grant in page 2020, you also obliged by signing the contract of funding that you will follow the ethical practices, that all the EU and national laws are applicable to your research, and that you follow the principles of research integrity, and they are spelled out here in the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, which was published by the ALIA and adopted by the European Commission to be a standard. As I say, you sign and you guarantee that you're following this by signing the contract with the EU for funds. But we know that it doesn't work. We know that there is increasingly more and more papers that are retracted. Very good read sometimes like a thriller, is the site that's called the Retraction Watch. They publish it every day, but you can read their weekend summaries. When they tell you about the cases that get published about research misconduct and retracted papers. And you learn a lot. I often think that if people had invented so much effort in doing research that they invented it lying and cheating, they would have won a Nobel Prize, because sometimes there is so much effort in what can be done. And there are different levels of cheating. Not only that you kind of make up or change your laboratory data. Have you ever heard of avatar misconduct? You know what avatar is? You're a person that you become when you play the video game. So Office for Research Integrity in the United States described avatar misconduct. So they had a case when a researcher was accused of falsifying data, and they started an investigation. And the researcher said, oh, it's not me. I sent all my samples to another researcher in another city. I sent her samples, she sent me results, and this is all I've got. You better talk to her. So this committee did talk to this other person. They exchanged emails. But after some time, they discovered it was this person that created a personality and an email of the other person who took the blame for her in this research. You have people that have reviewed their own papers. It was a big scandal. I think ESC had to retract I don't know how many papers in their journals, because this scam was discovered that, journals very often ask authors to suggest reviewers. So you can suggest a reviewer and give it a Gmail email address to a well-known person. It's a Gmail that you created, and everything to this person comes to you. So you review your own paper and say that's good, you find some little faults that are manageable, and then you get published based on the peer review of your own journal. It was discovered only because the response of reviewers came so quickly that the editor was surprised that an author, that the reviewer would reply within 48 hours that they started investigating this, so these were the fake emails that were published. There are many resources for that. If you go to the Office of Research Integrity in the United States, you have resources, and then you can either have a case book. It's very interesting to read these personal accounts, so that these are real people and real cases that happen on different things, as I said, from authorship, research misconduct, collaboration, data acquisition, conflicts of interest. So you can read true stories and learn more about what can happen and how people dealt with these stories. Very often it's a grey area. There are no black and white answers, but very often it's the problem that nobody told people how to do the right thing, and then when things got bad, then everybody suffered in there. These are just some examples. Probably those from my medicine who was a researcher from North Korea. He was the first in the world to claim that he created human embryonic cells by cloning. So the Nobel Prize was there, waiting for him. But whistleblowers, so people who spoke anonymously about what actually went in his lab, showed that he actually cheated, that he faked his results. He also did a lot of image manipulation, taking the same figure and presented it both as a control group and the experimental group. And he was sentenced to prison, but this sentence, prison sentence was changed to community service. And he had 2 science articles retracted. So, for example, you don't see that well, but if you look at what he presented, the 2 middle figures in the lower row are obviously identical figures. But he presented them as the figures for 2 different groups. So it was gross data, image manipulation. And before that time, science, although there were procedures for checking the integrity of digital images, science refused to use them because they said, oh, we are so good that nobody's going to lie to us. Although other journals who publish a lot of images say this is important and we have to check. But after this case, science, when you send your paper to science and it gets accepted, they will check all your figures for potential digital manipulation. Or this one, also in biology, where he was accused of falsification by his lab members, he admitted this misbehavior, but was fired from the MIT in the United States. He had 5 articles retracted and 1 in the Journal of Experimental Medicine. He also was sentenced to 6 months in jail, but then it was changed to home detention and electronic monitoring. So he had to have an ankle bracelet as a real criminal. Or this Eric Cohen, who faked all of his papers based on the money that he got from grants, and he was, I think, the first scientist in the United States that really actually went to jail for research misconduct and had to pay back the funds that he received for research. So, what we expect as editors from you is to make a declaration about authorship. Who did what? So in at least in biomedicine, you would be required to say, Anna Marshall gave an idea for study. I did the analysis of this and that. We both wrote the paper. So the contributions to research are now a common way of describing the authorship contributions. You would have to declare your conflicts of interest. You have to disclose your financial support. You have to state somewhere all the ethical principles that you followed and what kind of approvals you got in the method section. If you're doing clinical trials, you have to register it because no medical journal would accept such a paper. You have to follow the privacy statement. If you come from the otorhinolaryngology oral injury research, what kind of picture of your patients can you publish? How do you ask for informed consent for publishing figures? For example, British Medical Journal asks of you that you have a signed letter from each patient that you present in the case record that the patient agrees that his or her figure is published in this paper. And image manipulation, as I said. So I have just opened a door to all of these issues, and there is much more information on the internet. I think this is a good. Can I turn in a paper without citing all sources? It says no, and cite Shakespeare. Act 3, Scene 1, line 56 from Hamlet. So it's ridiculous. Of course, you can say no without citing. But these are serious issues that are taken up seriously by many journals, and this is something that you should keep on being informed and learn about because it's the reality of publishing.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You said that paper
With us, you have to publish one paper to defend the topic of your thesis, and you have to publish a second paper from this thesis in order to defend your thesis. So in biomedicine, very often the rules are that you actually slowly kind of generate your PhD by publishing papers first, and then when you have sufficient amount of published papers, you defend it as a PhD. It's kind of Scandinavian model of 3 papers that you publish and defend it there. So that's a solution. I know that it's not a custom, especially in social sciences and humanities, but this is also a true problem, which is, you have a PhD, you have invested money, effort in this research, and now it doesn't get published because your student has left and doesn't answer your emails. Prevention is always the best. So the student signs a small contract saying, when I defend the thesis, if I do not answer, I will leave my forwarding address to the research group and to my mentor, and I believe that if I'm not comfortable, if I don't answer the emails, the professor has the right, or the group has the right to continue publishing this without me. Because theoretically, a person who hasn't contributed to writing the paper cannot be an author. So you can acknowledge that this person, you can maybe move it on. They can also be part of the agreement saying, okay, if you go and I cannot find you, you will be the second or third or whatever author is there. So I think it's best to think of the possibilities how things can go wrong and try to prevent them. By a simple email, it's always important to leave a document of some kind that you have tried. This is, for example, also in research ethics. Very often you get social sciences, so you want to go to, I don't know, ask an HR to study something, some cultural studies. Who are you going to ask for ethics approval? You get ethics approval from your institution, but theoretically you have to ask for permission at every location where you're doing the study. You go to another country, they say, oh, we don't fund that research, we are not legally obliged or mandated to give you ethics approval. So you try, you write to them, they write to you, and then again, it's okay to have only the ethical approval of your home institution if you can prove that you have made an effort to get approvals for this study, but you couldn't go to get it. Okay, it's the same here. It's best to have a document, some kind of small contract, or an email that you wrote to the student, and the student wrote back, yes, I agree, and you keep it in your documentation to prevent such problems. Because there is indeed research that never got published because a student couldn't be found afterwards and is an author of this study.
Thank you for the presentation. What is the procedure for using another data from another article? Just if I want to use another data from other person and to use it in legal way, and I want to manipulate it to fit my article, what is the legal procedure? What should I do?
Okay, it depends on what you're using. If you're using someone's data as a historical control, so this is, again, you can, in statistical comparisons, you can have 2 groups, so but you can have your group and you're comparing it to a historical control. You can say, I took data from this paper and used it for comparison with my data. As long as you're transparent about what you did, it's fine. But if you want to pick up and talk more about this, infringement of copyright, if you want to take a figure from another paper and publish it in your textbook or your article, that's a little bit different because you have to see who owns the rights of copyright, whether it's free for everybody, whether it's like a common license that everybody can use it, or is it under copyright that you have to ask for permission. Okay? But if you want to use numerical data from somebody, you don't need to ask them for that. If you cite where you got this data and use it in a transparent way, this is fine. Okay, there was another question.
My question is regarding the citation. Let's say I'm citing an article in my discussion, which is in the same topic, citing to another article, which is also citing to another article. So, all citing the same point. Using the last article, will it be in an ethical immoral position, or do I have to follow the train to the first article?
I think you can, the proper way would be to find the original article where the discovery was made and cite there. But you can make it a bit easier for you so that you don't have to look for the paper from 1934. You can say, you know, the recent review of literature or recent systematic review addresses this question. So, and talk discovery of this guy, whatever, and then you can cite that as a review paper. If it is clear that it's a review paper, and not say this guy did this and you cite somebody else, that would be inappropriate. But if you put it in the context of a review of literature and say that this review emphasized the importance of the study of this author, it would be better. It's kind of a common sense approach that you see, you know, what you would like to be done to your work if somebody else is doing it, and then it's fair. And again, that it doesn't create so many problems for you that you cannot, that stops you from doing research. There's one question. One more, I think we make the last one because we have to go.
For example, as a psychological research, it hasn't been worked before that field, and you got informed consent, everything is right, you got the data, but you're making a new explanation and commenting on it. Would it be a fabrication or like it? At that situation, it does not sound really logical because it's a new explanation. Would it be?
Yeah, potentially it is an explanation